The old man wasn't a beggar, he was being hunted. Outside Mickey's diner, rain struck the pavement like gunfire, while Avery Mitchell watched from behind the fogged glass. His suit was torn, his cufflinks real gold, and a bruise bloomed along his jaw, proof he didn't belong to the streets. She should have stayed inside. Just poured coffee, minded her shift, ignored the storm. Instead, she grabbed a bowl of stew and stepped into the rain, offering mercy to someone the city feared in silence. By morning, detectives would call her name. By nightfall, every door in Queens would know who she'd fed. Some debts are paid in blood, and some stories start with a single act of kindness. Subscribe before this one disappears into the dark. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday that felt like the end of everything. Avery stared at the stark white paper taped to her apartment door, the words, "Final Notice," screaming in bold red letters that might as well have been written in her own blood. 30 days. She had 30 days to come up with $800 she didn't have for a one-bedroom apartment in Queens that wasn't worth half that amount. But it was hers, or had been, and losing it meant losing the last thread connecting her to the life she'd tried so hard to build. The apartment behind the notice was a study in careful poverty. Everything she owned could fit in 2 suitcases and a garbage bag, but each item had been chosen with the desperate precision of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. The second-hand couch she'd found on Craigslist, the lamp with the crooked shade that still gave good light, the single photograph of her parents tucked into the corner of a mirror that came with the place. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and the thought of losing it made her chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to panic. The morning shift dragged on in a haze of noise and cheap perfume, the kind of exhaustion that blurred hours into one long ache. Her focus kept slipping between the ticking clock above the register and the reflection of her eviction notice still crumpled in her apron pocket, caught in the warped surface of the coffee pot. Each customer who left without tipping felt like another nail in her coffin. Mrs. Rodriguez from the dry cleaner next door ordered her usual black coffee and toast, counting out exact change from a coin purse that had seen better decades. The construction workers grabbed coffee and donuts to go, their hard hats still dusty from yesterday's job, their jokes loud enough to drown out the worry in their voices about next week's paycheck. By 3 o'clock, when Paige Winters clocked in for the evening shift, Avery's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her order pad. Paige took one look at her face and poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked, sliding one across the counter with the expertise of someone who'd seen too many people hit rock bottom in a place like this. The coffee tasted like the night before, stale, metallic, and too familiar to complain about. She swallowed it anyway, because that's what you did when there was nothing else left to taste. "You look like hell," warmed over. Paige said, her voice carrying the rough edges of a woman who'd survived worse than whatever was eating at Avery. At 32, Paige had the kind of face that had seen enough to know when someone was drowning, the kind of wisdom that came from too many nights working places like Mickey's. "Do you ever feel like the universe is personally invested in making your life miserable?" Avery asked, showing her the eviction notice. Paige's expression shifted from casual concern to genuine worry as she read the stark language of legal abandonment. 800 Jesus Avery. "You have a family you can call?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the ancient coffee machine, unanswered, because they both knew the answer. Family was a luxury. Avery had never been able to afford parents who died too young and left her with nothing but their debts and the kind of loneliness that settled in your bones like winter cold. That's when she remembered the old man from 3 nights ago. He'd left something behind after she'd given him her coat, slipping it under her coffee cup when she wasn't looking. A simple white card with a phone number written in careful script and 6 words that had seemed meaningless. Then, "Call when you need help. Promise kept." She'd tucked it into her apron pocket and forgotten about it until desperation made her remember. The card was still there, crisp and clean, despite 3 days of being carried around as if it had been protected by something more reliable than the worn fabric of her uniform. "There might be someone," she told Paige, pulling out the card. The paper felt heavier than it should, substantial in a way that made her fingertips tingle with possibilities she didn't dare name. "Some old guy I helped out last week. Leave me his number." Paige squinted at the card, her expression shifting from curiosity to something that looked suspiciously like concern. The number was written in fountain pen, the kind of elegant script that spoke of education and old money things that didn't usually find their way into places like Mickey's. "Avery, honey, are you sure about this? Men who hand out cards to pretty waitresses in dive diners, they usually want something in return, and it's usually not something you want to give." Paige's voice carried the weight of experience of women who'd learned too late that kindness from strangers often came with strings attached. "I've seen this movie before, and it doesn't usually have a happy ending." The warning settled between them like a stone in still water, sending ripples of doubt through Avery's already fragile resolve. But the eviction notice crinkled in her pocket every time she moved, a constant reminder that she was running out of options as quickly as she was running out of time. "What choice do I have?" she asked, more to herself than to Paige. "I'm about to be homeless. If this guy wants to help, maybe I should let him." The words tasted bitter, like surrender, but they were the only words she had left. Around them, the diner hummed with its usual evening rhythm. The coffee machine gurgling, the grill sizzling with someone's forgotten order. The sounds of survival in a city that didn't care whether you made it or not. As the sun set over Queens, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for a day this ugly, Avery found herself standing outside the diner with the card in her hand and her heart hammering against her ribs. The number seemed to pulse on the paper, 10 digits that could change everything or destroy what little she had left. Around her, the city hummed with its usual evening symphony of car horns and distant sirens, the soundtrack of 8 million people trying to make it through another day. The air smelled of exhaust and possibility of endings and beginnings happening simultaneously on every corner. When she returned home that night, the hallway light was already off, and the landlord had cut power to the whole floor again. It wasn't just about the rent anymore. It was survival. She dialed the number before she could change her mind, her fingers trembling as they found each digit. It rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, warm and cultured in a way that didn't match the broken man she'd fed 3 nights ago. "Hello, Avery. I've been hoping you would call." The fact that he knew her name before she said it should have terrified her. Instead, it felt oddly comforting, like stepping into a warm room after years in the cold. "I believe you might need a friend right about now." The conversation that followed was brief and polite, arrangements made with the kind of efficiency that spoke of money and influence. They would meet tomorrow at an address in Manhattan, somewhere she'd never been but had always imagined existed just out of reach of people like her. The man's voice, which she now remembered belonged to someone named William, carried the cadence of old New York, the kind of accent that suggested brownstones and private schools and summers somewhere other than the city. He spoke like someone accustomed to being listened to, but there was something else beneath the polish, something that sounded almost like loneliness. After she hung up, Avery stood in the dying light and wondered if she'd just made the smartest decision of her life, or the last mistake she'd ever have the chance to regret. The card felt different in her hand now, heavier somehow, as if it carried the weight of choices not yet made and consequences not yet understood. But for the first time in months, the crushing weight of hopelessness had lifted just enough for her to breathe. Tomorrow would bring answers, or it would bring something else entirely. Either way, it would bring change, and change was the only thing she had left to hope for. The city lights began to flicker on around her, each one a story, each story a life, hanging in the balance between what was and what might be. The law office of Whitfield and Associates occupied the 23rd floor of a glass tower that scraped the belly of Manhattan's sky, the kind of building where people like Avery usually only came to clean the windows or empty the trash. She stood on the sidewalk outside, clutching her purse with sweaty palms and staring up at the gleaming facade that reflected her own uncertainty back at her in fractured pieces. Harold Brennan had made good on his threat that morning, changing the locks while she was at work and leaving her belongings in 2 black garbage bags on the sidewalk like discarded memories. He wasn't supposed to. City law forbade evictions without notice, but rules never mattered when tenants couldn't afford lawyers. Everything she owned now sat in the trunk of her 15-year-old Honda, and the car itself was running on fumes and borrowed time. The November wind cut through her thin jacket with the precision of a blade, carrying the scent of roasted nuts from a street vendor, and exhaust from taxis that moved through the canyon of buildings like yellow fish in a concrete river. She felt misplaced in the reflection staring back one wrong color in a perfect painting. Her heartbeat hammered against her ribs as she watched people in expensive coats flow around her like water around a stone, each one looking like they belonged in a world where eviction notices were abstract concepts rather than life-altering realities. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, the kind of understated wealth that whispered instead of shouted. Security guards in pressed uniforms nodded politely as she passed, their eyes taking in her thrift store dress and scuffed shoes without judgment. But she felt exposed anyway, like a fraud walking through a museum she had no right to visit. The elevator rose silently through floors of power and privilege, each number lighting up like a countdown to something she couldn't name. When the doors opened on 23, she was greeted by a receptionist whose smile was as polished as the brass nameplate on her desk. "Miss Mitchell, Mr. Whitfield is expecting you. Right this way." The woman's voice carried the crisp efficiency of expensive education and daily manicures. She led Avery down a hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men in dark suits, their eyes following her progress like silent judges weighing her worthiness. The office at the end of the hall was larger than her entire apartment had been, with windows that offered a view of the city that made her feel dizzy with possibility and terror in equal measure. Central Park spread out below like a green handkerchief dropped on a table of concrete and steel, and she could see tiny figures moving along its paths like ants navigating a world that made sense only from a distance. James Whitfield rose from behind a desk that could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier, extending a hand that was soft and manicured but somehow reassuring. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 52, with silver threading through dark hair, and the kind of tan that came from weekends in the Hamptons rather than construction sites. "Miss Mitchell, please have a seat. Mr. Grayson sends his apologies for not meeting you here personally, but he felt this might be more comfortable for you." "I have to admit I'm not really sure why I'm here," Avery said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. "William, Mr. Grayson, he said something about a job, but he wasn't very specific." She could hear the nervousness in her own voice, the way it climbed higher when she was scared, and she forced herself to breathe deeper to project a confidence she didn't feel. Whitfield smiled, the expression genuine but somehow careful, as if he were handling something fragile that might break if he moved too quickly. "Mr. Grayson is a very private man, Miss Mitchell. He values discretion above almost everything else. What he's offering you is quite unique, the position of personal companion and household manager for a gentleman who frankly has more money than he knows what to do with and very little family left to share it with. Sir, companion." The word hung between them like a question mark, loaded with implications she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. She'd heard stories, cautionary tales whispered between waitresses about women who'd taken jobs that promised easy money and delivered something else entirely. "I need to be clear about what that means, Mr. Whitfield. I don't do anything." Her voice trailed off, heat rising in her cheeks as she struggled to find words for boundaries she'd never had to articulate before. "Nothing like that, I assure you," Whitfield said quickly, his tone shifting to something warmer, more paternal. "Mr. Grayson is 75 years old, Miss Mitchell. What he needs is someone to ensure he takes his medications, to cook meals he'll actually eat, to read to him when his eyes grow tired, and to simply be present in a house that's grown too quiet for one man to bear alone. He's offering you room and board in his home, plus a salary that I think you'll find more than generous." He slid a folder across the desk, the paper inside making a whisper of sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office. The number on the contract made her blink twice to ensure she'd read it correctly, then a third time because numbers that large seemed to exist in a different language than the one she'd learned to speak. It was more than she'd made in the past year at Mickey's, more money than she'd ever imagined having access to in her entire life. "Why me?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "He doesn't know me. One conversation over a bowl of soup doesn't exactly constitute a job interview." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but she needed to understand what she was stepping into before she signed anything that might change everything. "Mr. Grayson has very good instincts about people, Miss Mitchell. He's built a successful life by trusting those instincts." Whitfield's answer felt both complete and insufficient, like a door that opened only halfway. He saw something in you that night, something that convinced him you were exactly what he's been looking for. Sometimes, the best qualifications have nothing to do with resumes or references. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message that made her stomach drop like a stone thrown into dark water. Her car had been towed from the parking spot where she'd left it, and the impound fee was more than the vehicle was worth. Everything she owned was now locked behind a chain-link fence she couldn't afford to breach, and the irony wasn't lost on her that salvation was being offered at the exact moment her last lifeline was cut. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said quietly, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff into darkness. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of surrender and the strange lightness that came with having no choices left to make. "I suppose that makes this decision easier than it should be." "Then perhaps this is exactly where you're meant to be," Whitfield replied, returning to his desk with papers that would change the trajectory of her life. "Mr. Grayson's driver will be waiting downstairs to take you to the house. Your things, whatever you need, can be arranged." He handed her a pen that felt heavier than it should, the weight of decisions and consequences balanced on its tip. "Welcome to your new life, Miss Mitchell." The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a pre-war building on the Upper East Side, the kind of address that appeared in movies about people whose problems were solved by money rather than created by the lack of it. Avery followed William Grayson through rooms that seemed to exist in a different century, where Persian rugs muffled footsteps on hardwood floors that gleamed like dark water and oil paintings watched from walls that had witnessed decades of conversations she could only imagine. The elevator that carried them to the penthouse was lined with mirrors and mahogany, creating infinite reflections of her overwhelmed face that seemed to stretch into eternity. The hallway beyond was carpeted in deep burgundy that swallowed sound, and the walls were hung with paintings that looked like they belonged in museums, each one probably worth more than she'd earn in several lifetimes. William moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had betrayed him in small ways over the years, but his mind remained sharp as winter air. He was nothing like the broken figure she'd encountered outside the diner, though she could see traces of that vulnerability in the way he touched furniture as he passed, as if anchoring himself to solid things in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. "I imagine this is quite different from what you're accustomed to," he said, his voice carrying the same cultured warmth she remembered from their phone conversation. There was no condescension in his tone, just a gentle acknowledgement of the chasm between their worlds spoken by someone who remembered what it felt like to live on the other side of money and privilege. The living room alone was larger than most apartments, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Central Park like a living painting that changed with every shift of light and shadow. It was too perfect, too quiet, the kind of beauty that demanded gratitude just to be allowed to exist. Books lined every available wall, their spines creating a tapestry of knowledge and stories that spoke of a lifetime spent learning. The perfection made her nervous rather than comforted, as if she were standing in a museum where one wrong move might shatter something irreplaceable. "You live here alone." The question came out more directly than she'd intended. But something about the space felt designed for more people than just one elderly man. There were too many chairs around the dining table, too many photographs on side tables that suggested a life once filled with more voices and laughter than the silence that seemed to permeate every corner now. Mostly. The word carried weight, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the conversation that she could feel but not quite understand. "My son visits when his schedule allows, but his work keeps him very busy. He's in the family business, you might say, though it's become more consuming than I ever intended it to be." William settled into a wing-back chair that had molded itself to his frame over years of use, gesturing for her to take the sofa opposite. "I raised him from the time he was 12 years old after his parents died. Sometimes I wonder if I did him any favors." There was something in his tone that suggested depths she wasn't sure she was meant to explore, currents of regret and responsibility that ran deeper than simple parental concern. "What kind of business?" she asked, settling into cushions that were probably worth more than everything she'd owned before this morning. The question felt both natural and somehow dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might or might not hold her weight. "Import and export primarily. The family's been in it for generations, though it's evolved significantly over the years. His answer came easily, but she noticed how his hands moved when he spoke, fingers turning a gold ring that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Nathan, that's my son. He's expanded operations considerably since taking over. More ambitious than I ever was, I suppose. Sometimes ambition can be its own kind of prison. The afternoon dissolved into evening as William shared stories of raising a boy who'd lost everything, of trying to provide stability in a world that seemed designed to steal it away. He spoke of teaching Nathan chess and algebra, of attending school plays and graduations, of watching a damaged child slowly heal into something resembling wholeness. But there were gaps in the narrative spaces where other stories lived, and Avery found herself filling them with imagination and instinct. "You were a teacher before," she said, not quite a question, but an observation drawn from the way he explained things, the patience in his voice when he described complex concepts, the reverence with which he spoke about learning and growth. "Mathematics at a public school in the Bronx. 37 years of trying to convince children that numbers could be beautiful, that logic could be their salvation." His smile carried the bittersweet weight of memory of battles won and lost in classrooms that had seen too much and too little of hope. "I met Nathan during my last year teaching. He was living on the street, surviving by wit and luck and very little else. Sometimes I think he saved me as much as I saved him." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the sound of a key in the lock announced an arrival that changed the temperature of the room in subtle but unmistakable ways. The man who entered moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to being watched, evaluated, potentially threatened. Nathan Cross was younger than Avery had expected, maybe 45, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw in a matter of seconds. "Will," he said, crossing the room to embrace the older man with genuine affection that softened the sharp edges of his presence. "You didn't tell me we had company." His eyes found Avery with the kind of attention that felt like being X-rayed, but when William explained her presence, Nathan's expression shifted to something that might have been gratitude mixed with calculation. "So, you're the angel who's been taking care of the old man. I was wondering when I'd get to thank you properly." Nathan's voice was smooth, educated, carrying the kind of authority that came naturally to men who'd learned early that the world would listen when they spoke. But there was something underneath it, a quality she couldn't quite name, that made her think of deep water and hidden currents. The three of them shared dinner around a table that had probably hosted conversations that shaped the city, maybe the country. Nathan spoke about his work in vague terms that suggested importance without revealing specifics, and Avery found herself studying the interplay between father and son, the way they moved around certain subjects like dancers avoiding broken glass. There was love there, genuine and deep, but also something else, a tension that spoke of choices made and prices paid that neither man wanted to examine too closely. "Avery's going to be staying with us for a while," William announced over dessert, watching his son's reaction with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read between lines. "The house has been too quiet lately, and I could use the company." Nathan's response was measured, professional, but she caught something flickering behind his eyes. A calculation that made her wonder what she'd stepped into and whether she was prepared for the consequences. "Welcome to the family," Nathan said, raising his wine glass in a toast that felt both genuine and somehow ominous. The crystal caught the light from the chandelier above, fracturing it into tiny rainbows that danced across the white tablecloth like promises and warnings in equal measure. Outside, the city glittered with its own light, 8 million stories playing out in windows and streets, and Avery realized that hers had just taken a turn she could never have anticipated. Later, as William showed her to a bedroom that was larger and more elegant than any space she'd ever inhabited, she found herself wondering about the man who'd taken her in and the son who seemed to carry shadows in his wake. The room had its own fireplace and a view of the park that made her feel like she was living inside a painting. But it also felt temporary, like a beautiful prison she might not be able to leave when she wanted to. "Sleep well," William said from the doorway, his voice carrying a warmth that felt genuine, but also somehow fragile, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her that everything would be all right. "Tomorrow we'll start your new life properly." As the door closed behind him, Avery stood at the window looking out at a city that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign, wondering what kind of life she'd just agreed to live. and what kind of person she might become in the process. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock struck midnight, its chime echoing too long as if counting down to something neither of them could see. 3 weeks into her new life, Avery had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and surreal, like learning to breathe underwater. She woke each morning surrounded by comfort that felt unearned, a daily reminder that gratitude could sometimes feel like guilt. The marble bathroom with its heated floors, the walk-in closet larger than her old bedroom, the view that stretched across Central Park like a private painting, all of it beautiful, all of it making her feel like an imposter wearing someone else's life. William was an easy companion, grateful for her presence without being demanding, and their conversations ranged from philosophy to mathematics to the kind of gentle observations about human nature that came from decades of watching the world change. The apartment had revealed its secrets slowly, like a flower opening one petal at a time. She discovered a library that contained first editions worth more than small houses, a wine cellar that held bottles from years she hadn't been born, and a study where William spent hours working on what he called personal projects, but never fully explained. Nathan visited twice a week, always impeccably dressed, always polite, but there was something in his interactions with his father that suggested conversations happening beneath the surface of their words. It was while dusting the study that she noticed the faint scuff marks on the hardwood floor, small scratches that suggested something heavy had been moved repeatedly in the same pattern. The marks led to what appeared to be a solid bookshelf, but when she pressed against it while cleaning a section, gave way to reveal the hidden panel behind it. The space behind it was small, but organized with the precision of someone who understood that secrets required careful maintenance. Ledgers lined narrow shelves, their leather bindings worn smooth by decades of handling, and the numbers inside them told stories she wasn't sure she was meant to read. Columns of figures that didn't match any legitimate business she could imagine, names that sounded familiar in ways that made her stomach tighten with unease. The photographs were what stopped her breath entirely. William, decades younger, standing next to men in expensive suits whose eyes held the kind of hardness that came from making decisions most people couldn't live with. Nathan, as a teenager, already carrying himself with the confidence that would later define him, shaking hands with people whose names she recognized from newspaper headlines about organized crime in New York. The images told a story that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about the gentleman who asked her to read him poetry and remembered to thank her for every meal she prepared. Import and export, she whispered to herself, understanding now why those words had felt incomplete when William had first spoken them. The ledgers contained records of transactions that had nothing to do with legitimate goods crossing borders, numbers that represented power and influence, measured in ways that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly reports. She glanced quickly around the room, checking for cameras or other surveillance, before photographing several pages with her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she was seeing before carefully returning everything to its exact position and closing the panel. The rest of the day passed in a haze of normalcy that felt like acting in a play where she'd forgotten her lines. William asked her to read from Thoreau, and she stumbled over words that had seemed simple an hour earlier. He noticed her distraction, his pale eyes studying her face with the kind of attention that made her wonder how much he could see and what conclusions he was drawing from her obvious discomfort. "Sometimes knowledge is a burden, my dear," he said quietly, as if he could read her thoughts. "The question is whether we're strong enough to carry it." That evening, Nathan arrived for dinner earlier than usual, and she found herself studying him with new eyes, looking for traces of the teenager in those old photographs, trying to reconcile the man who kissed William's forehead with genuine affection with the reality of what his business actually entailed. The conversation over dinner felt different now, loaded with subtext she was finally beginning to understand. When Nathan mentioned a shipping delay that would require him to handle things personally, she recognized the euphemisms for what they were. "Avery's been wonderful company," William said, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth as he watched his son's reaction. "She has such an interesting perspective on things. Very observant." The words felt like a test, or perhaps a warning, and she found herself caught between two men who were having a conversation she could only partially follow. Nathan's smile was warm, but his eyes held a calculation that made her skin prickle with awareness of how little she actually knew about the world she'd stepped into. "I'm sure she is," Nathan replied, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's important to appreciate people who notice things, who understand the value of discretion." The word hung in the air between them like a blade, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Avery excused herself before dessert, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated, and retreated to her room to try to process what she'd learned and what it meant for her future. From her window, she could see the city spreading out below like arteries carrying the lifeblood of 8 million souls, each light a pulse in the vast organism that never truly slept. Somewhere in that network of streets and buildings, Nathan was conducting business that had nothing to do with import and export in any conventional sense. William, the gentleman who asked her to make his tea a little stronger each morning and who remembered every story she'd told him about her childhood, was part of something that existed in the shadows between legal and illegal, between family loyalty and organized crime. The realization that she was living under the protection of what could only be described as a crime family should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, she found herself thinking about the genuine affection between William and Nathan, the way they looked out for each other despite the obvious tensions in their relationship. She thought about William's stories of rescuing Nathan from the streets, of providing him with education and opportunity, and wondered how many other lives he'd touched in ways that had nothing to do with the darker aspects of his business dealings. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and the message was simple enough to seem innocent, but specific enough to make her blood run cold. "Beautiful night for a walk in the park. Too bad some people never get to enjoy simple pleasures." The implication was clear enough to someone who'd just discovered she was living at the center of a world where casual threats were probably as common as business cards. Someone knew where she was, knew enough about her situation to reach out with words that sounded like a promise of future contact. She deleted the message and turned off her phone, but sleep was impossible that night. Instead, she stood at her window watching the city breathe, wondering if she was a guest in this beautiful apartment or something closer to a prisoner in a very elegant cage. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. Then 1, then 2, its steady rhythm marking time in a world where everything she thought she understood had shifted beneath her feet like sand in an earthquake. The morning William disappeared, Avery woke to silence that felt different from the usual quiet of the penthouse, heavier and somehow expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. She'd grown accustomed to the sounds of his morning routine over the past month, the soft whistle of the kettle for his early tea, the gentle shuffle of his slippers on the hardwood floors, the rustle of newspaper pages being turned with the careful precision of someone who still believed in the ritual of reading the news on paper rather than screens. None of those sounds greeted her that morning. Instead, there was only the hum of the building's heating system and the distant murmur of traffic far below the kind of silence that suggested absence rather than sleep. She found his bed unslept in the covers still pulled tight with military precision, and his reading glasses folded neatly on the nightstand next to a book that was bookmarked exactly where it had been the night before. The kitchen showed no signs of his usual morning preparation, no cup waiting by the kettle, no plate set out for the toast he always had with his tea. In the study, she found the letter. It was placed precisely in the center of his desk, her name written across the envelope in William's careful script, and the paper inside carried the weight of finality that made her hands shake as she unfolded it. The ink was slightly faded, suggesting he'd written it weeks ago and kept it sealed, waiting for a day he'd hoped might never come. "My dear Avery, it began. If you are reading this, then I have been taken by people who believe they can use an old man's life as leverage against someone I love more than my own safety. Please do not blame yourself for what has happened. You have brought more joy to my final months than I had any right to expect." The letter continued with instructions that seemed surreal in their specificity. She was to call Nathan immediately to tell him that Vincent Moretti had made good on threats that apparently stretched back decades, and to emphasize that any retaliation would result in consequences for William that neither of them could accept. "Nathan will want to respond with force," the letter warned. "He has been trained to meet violence with greater violence, but this situation requires a different approach. Help him understand that some battles cannot be won through strength alone." The deadline was stark and unforgiving: 48 hours for Nathan to withdraw from territories in Brooklyn that had been contested for the better part of a decade, 48 hours to dismantle operations that represented millions of dollars in revenue, 48 hours to surrender power that had taken years to accumulate. The alternative was stated with the kind of clinical precision that made it clear this was a business transaction rather than an emotional plea. William's life would end quietly, and his body would be found in a place that would serve as a message to anyone else who might consider challenging Moretti's expanding influence. When Nathan arrived 20 minutes after her call, his usual composure was replaced by something raw and dangerous that made the air in the apartment feel charged with electricity. He read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each word, and when he looked up, Avery saw something in his eyes that reminded her why people crossed the street to avoid men like him. Moretti. He said the name, tasting like poison in his mouth. I should have killed him years ago when Will asked me to show mercy. The letter says you'll want to use force, Avery said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. But William thinks that's exactly what this Moretti person is counting on. Maybe he wants you to start a war. She watched Nathan pace the length of the living room like a caged predator, his movements controlled but barely contained, and realized that she was seeing him without the careful mask he usually wore. This was Nathan Cross, as his enemies saw him dangerous and unpredictable. Someone who'd learned to survive in a world where hesitation meant death. You don't understand, Nathan said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was more frightening than shouting would have been. Moretti has been testing boundaries for months, pushing into territory that my family has controlled for decades. This isn't just about revenge, it's about power. If I back down now, every other family in the city will see it as weakness. They'll tear apart everything Will and I built together. The words came out clipped and precise, each one weighted with implications she was only beginning to grasp. But as the morning wore on and the reality of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket, something unexpected happened. Nathan began to listen, really listen to what she was saying, and she found herself offering insights that surprised them both. Her years of analyzing customer behavior at the diner, of reading the subtle signs that told her who was likely to tip and who was looking for trouble, translated unexpectedly well to understanding the psychology of extortion and territorial disputes. Moretti chose 48 hours for a reason, she said, spreading the financial documents she'd found in William's hidden office across the dining room table. It's not enough time for you to organize a proper response, but it's long enough for word to spread about what's happening. He wants other people to see you make this choice. The question is whether there's a way to give him what he wants publicly while keeping what you actually need privately. Nathan stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, and she realized that she'd just proposed something that sounded suspiciously like a strategy for managing organized crime territorial disputes. The woman who'd been serving coffee and scrambled eggs 6 weeks ago was now sitting in a penthouse apartment, analyzing ledgers that documented illegal activities and suggesting tactics for dealing with kidnapping and extortion. The transformation should have shocked her more than it did. They spent the afternoon mapping out Moretti's likely moves, identifying the locations where William might be held, and developing contingency plans that assumed violence was a last resort rather than a first option. Nathan made phone calls in languages she didn't recognize to people whose names he didn't share, building a network of information that slowly revealed the shape of the crisis they were facing. By evening, they had narrowed down the probable locations to 3 warehouses in Red Hook, all connected to shipping companies that existed more on paper than in reality. There's something else, Nathan said as they sat in the study reviewing their options. Will has been teaching you things, hasn't he? Not just reading and cooking, but other skills. Financial analysis, pattern recognition, the kind of thinking that goes beyond what most people would need for taking care of an elderly man. The observation was stated as fact rather than question, and Avery realized that William's patient lessons in understanding complex financial documents hadn't been casual conversation but preparation for exactly this kind of situation. The final piece of the puzzle came when she remembered the text message from the unknown number, the casual threat that had seemed random at the time but now felt like part of a larger pattern. "Moretti's been watching me," she said, showing Nathan the message she'd saved despite deleting it initially. "He knows I've learned things, knows I'm more than just hired help." Maybe that's why the timeline is so tight. He's not just putting pressure on you, he's putting pressure on both of us. As night fell over the city, they finalized their plan. She realized she no longer felt like a bystander. The woman who once counted tips now measured risks and consequences. It was risky and depended on assumptions about human psychology that could prove fatally wrong. But it offered something that a direct assault could not: the possibility of saving William without starting a war that would consume everyone they cared about. Nathan would appear to capitulate, making the territorial concessions that Moretti demanded while simultaneously gathering intelligence about William's exact location. Then, instead of the rescue operation that everyone would expect, Avery would walk directly into the trap. "You understand this is insane," Nathan said as they reviewed the details one final time. "You're talking about putting yourself in the hands of people who kill for a living, people who view human life as a business expense. If something goes wrong, I might not be able to get you both out." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned to calculate odds in life and death situations, someone who understood that good intentions were poor protection against bullets and bad judgment. "William saved you when you were 12 years old," Avery replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "He spent 30 years teaching you how to be strong, how to survive in a world that wants to destroy you. Maybe it's time someone returned the favor by showing that strength doesn't always mean violence." The words felt true as she spoke them, and she realized that somewhere in the process of planning William's rescue, she discovered something about herself that she hadn't known existed. The clock on the mantel chimed 11 times, marking the passage of another hour in their dwindling timeline. In less than 24 hours, they would know whether their plan had worked, or whether they'd made a series of choices that would end with all three of them dead. Nathan poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and they drank in silence, toasting a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. Possibly both. Outside, the city glittered with its usual indifference to human drama, 8 million people going about their lives unaware that the fate of an elderly mathematics teacher and the future of organized crime territories in Brooklyn were being decided in a penthouse apartment where the wrong decision could reshape the criminal landscape of New York. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or tragedy, and the only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same again. The warehouse in Red Hook loomed in the morning haze, its air thick with metal and old secrets, surrounded by the kind of emptiness that came when legitimate business moved elsewhere and left only shadows behind. Avery stood across the street in the pale morning light, watching longshoremen begin their shifts at the active docks, half a mile away, and their voices carrying across the water like echoes of a world that still operated by rules she understood. The building where William was being held looked exactly like what it was: a place where people disappeared without official notice. Nathan's voice crackled through the earpiece she wore, hidden beneath hair she deliberately left loose to mask the small device. "Last chance to change your mind," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the night calculating odds that didn't favor any of them. "Moretti's people are inside, probably armed, definitely dangerous. Once you walk through that door, I can't guarantee I'll be able to get you both out alive." She could hear tension in his voice that he was trying to mask with professional calm, the sound of a man who'd learned to compartmentalize fear but couldn't quite eliminate it entirely. "William walked into Mickey's diner on a night when he could have chosen anywhere else to wait out the rain," she replied, adjusting the small recording device concealed in her jacket pocket. "Maybe sometimes the right choice is the one that doesn't make sense from the outside." The words felt braver than she felt, but there was truth in them that steadied her nerves as she crossed the empty street toward a building that might contain her death or her redemption, possibly both. The front entrance was secured with a chain that looked more theatrical than functional, the kind of barrier designed to discourage casual exploration rather than determined entry. She knocked on the metal door with the deliberate rhythm Nathan had suggested: 3 short raps, followed by 2 longer ones, a signal that would identify her as expected rather than accidental. The door opened to reveal a man whose face carried the kind of professional blankness that came from years of not asking questions about what he was paid to ignore. "Vincent's waiting upstairs," he said, his accent carrying traces of Brooklyn neighborhoods where loyalty was measured in silence and survival depended on knowing when to look away. He led her through a ground floor that had been stripped of everything valuable past machinery that had rusted into abstract sculptures and windows that had been painted black to prevent curious eyes from seeing inside. The stairs to the second floor creaked under their weight, each step sounding unnaturally loud in the hollow space. The room where she found William was larger than she'd expected, with furniture that suggested someone had taken care to make captivity comfortable rather than purely punitive. William sat in a wingback chair that looked like it had been transported directly from someone's living room, his clothes rumpled but clean, his face showing exhaustion, but not the kind of damage that suggested physical abuse. When he saw her, his expression shifted through surprise recognition and something that might have been resignation or relief. "Avery," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd hoped not to see her in this place, but wasn't entirely surprised by her presence. "I told them you were simply hired help, that you knew nothing about family business. I had hoped they would leave you out of this entirely." The disappointment in his voice was directed at himself rather than her, the sound of a man who'd tried to protect someone and watched that protection fail, despite his best efforts. Vincent Moretti stood by the windows overlooking the East River, his back turned as if their arrival was of only casual interest to him. When he faced them, Avery was struck by how ordinary he looked, like someone she might have served coffee to without a second thought. Middle-aged and unremarkable, except for eyes that held the kind of calculation that came from decades of making decisions other people couldn't live with. "Miss Mitchell," he said, her name pronounced with the careful enunciation of someone who'd done his research. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk." "I'm here to negotiate William's release," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but they were the only words that mattered in this room full of men who understood power in ways she was still learning. "Nathan is prepared to make the territorial concessions you've demanded, but he needs guarantees that this ends here, that there won't be additional demands once he's shown weakness." Moretti smiled, the expression carrying no warmth but a kind of professional appreciation for directness. "You've learned quickly, haven't you? 6 weeks ago, you were serving coffee to people who couldn't afford to tip properly. Now you're here negotiating the terms of organized crime territorial disputes. It's remarkable what circumstances can teach us about ourselves." He moved away from the window, circling her like a predator evaluating prey, but his attention felt more curious than threatening. "William taught me that numbers tell stories," she replied, holding his gaze, despite every instinct telling her to look away. "The numbers in your demands don't add up to revenge or even greed. They add up to something else entirely. You don't actually want the Brooklyn territories. You want Nathan to appear weak in front of other families so they'll move against him. This isn't about business expansion, it's about elimination." The observation hung in the air between them like a challenge, and she watched Moretti's expression shift from casual interest to something sharper. "Very good," he said, his tone carrying the kind of approval teachers gave to students who'd grasped a difficult concept. "William, you've chosen your protégé well. Yes, Miss Mitchell, you're quite right. Nathan Cross has built an empire that threatens the traditional balance of power in this city. If he appears weak, if other families believe he can be pressured into surrender, they'll tear him apart like wolves. The Brooklyn territories are just the price of admission to a much larger game." William spoke for the first time since her arrival, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 3 days thinking about choices and consequences. "Vincent, you were one of my students at Lincoln High School. You sat in the 3rd row, struggled with algebra until you learned that mathematics was just another language for describing relationships between things. I helped you pass the Regents exam that kept you from dropping out. Do you remember?" The question shifted something in the room's atmosphere, introducing a personal element that complicated the professional calculation Moretti had been maintaining. "I remember," he said quietly, his voice losing some of its predatory edge. "I also remember that you disappeared from teaching the same year that Nathan Cross began building his criminal organization. Curious timing, wouldn't you say, Mr. Grayson? I remember a boy who was angry at the world because it had given him so little to work with." William continued, his tone carrying the patient authority of someone who'd spent decades talking students through difficult problems. "I remember someone who was smart enough to see patterns others missed, but too hurt to believe that intelligence could be used for building rather than tearing down. The question now is whether that boy learned anything from our conversations about choice and consequence. Avery watched the interplay between teacher and former student, recognizing something in their dynamic that reminded her of Nathan's relationship with William, the way certain bonds transcended the categories that society used to define people as good or evil. What if there was a way to accomplish what you actually want without destroying either family? She asked, the idea forming as she spoke. What if Nathan's apparent weakness could be temporary, just long enough to draw out his real enemies, and what if you could position yourself as the power broker who engineered the solution? Both men stared at her as if she'd suggested something that bordered on impossible, but she could see calculation beginning to replace aggression in Moretti's expression. "Continue," he said, settling into a chair that faced Williams, the two of them suddenly looking more like old acquaintances catching up than captor and hostage engaged in a life-and-death negotiation. "Nathan withdraws from Brooklyn as demanded publicly and completely. Other families see this as weakness and begin moving against him just as you predicted. But the withdrawal was never real. It was theater designed to identify which families were planning to move against him anyway. When they overextend themselves trying to fill the vacuum, you and Nathan eliminate them together, splitting their territories and creating a new balance of power with you as senior partner." The plan sounded audacious, even to her own ears, but she could see both men considering its implications. "And what guarantee do I have that Nathan wouldn't simply eliminate me once I'd helped him destroy his other enemies?" Moretti asked, but his tone suggested professional interest rather than rejection. "Trust is not exactly a common currency in our line of work, Miss Mitchell. Men like Nathan and me don't survive by giving others the opportunity to betray us." "William," she said simply, looking at the older man whose presence had somehow become the moral center of a conversation about organized crime strategy. "He trusts you enough to let himself be captured because he knew it would force this conversation. Nathan trusts him enough to risk everything trying to get him back safely. Maybe the guarantee isn't a contract or a threat. Maybe it's just the fact that some relationships transcend business calculations." The silence that followed felt different from the tension that had filled the room when she'd arrived. Through the painted windows, she could hear the sounds of the working waterfront tugboats and cargo cranes, and the voices of people whose jobs had nothing to do with the life-and-death negotiations happening in an abandoned warehouse. The normal world continued its routines while three people who'd found themselves in an extraordinary situation tried to find a way forward that didn't end in violence. "I need guarantees," Moretti said finally, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd decided to take a calculated risk. "Nathan makes the withdrawal within 24 hours publicly and completely. He doesn't move against the families who fill the vacuum until I give the signal. And Miss Mitchell here stays with me as a gesture of good faith until the operation is complete." The last condition hung in the air like a sword, transforming her from negotiator back into hostage, but she could see the logic that made it necessary. Through her earpiece, she heard Nathan's sharp intake of breath, a sound that spoke of panic barely held in check. His voice tight with controlled desperation as he whispered, "No, absolutely not. No." William said immediately, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room. "Avery has done enough. She's given you a solution that benefits everyone involved. If you need a guarantee of good faith, I'll provide it. I'm an old man with very little time left regardless of what happens here. Let her go home." The offer was made with the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent a lifetime making difficult choices and accepted the consequences without complaint. Moretti's smile carried a calculating edge that suggested he'd gotten exactly what he'd wanted from this negotiation, though perhaps not in the way anyone else had expected. "Agreed, he said, but his eyes held depths that promised this arrangement would benefit him in ways none of them yet understood. Through her earpiece, she could hear Nathan's voice, urgent and concerned, asking for updates on a situation that had evolved far beyond their original plan. She touched the device, hoping he would understand that silence meant the situation was under control, that their carefully calculated rescue operation had become something else entirely. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, 8 million people navigating their own crises and celebrations, unaware that the balance of criminal power was being renegotiated in a room that smelled of rust and old concrete. The safe house Nathan had chosen was a brownstone in Park Slope, that looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, the kind of place where young professionals lived quiet lives and worried about mortgage payments rather than territorial wars between criminal families. Avery sat in the kitchen drinking coffee that tasted normal after 3 days of warehouse vending machine, sludge-watching William sleep in the living room chair he'd claimed upon their arrival 6 hours earlier. The rescue had gone differently than anyone had planned, but they were all alive, and Vincent Moretti had agreed to terms that might actually work for everyone involved. The negotiation had stretched through most of the afternoon, with Nathan arriving not as a rescuer, but as a participant in discussions that would reshape the criminal landscape of New York. Seeing him interact with Moretti had been educational in ways she hadn't expected, revealing layers of strategy and psychology that existed beneath the surface of what outsiders saw as simple violence and intimidation. These were businessmen, she realized, whose product happened to be fear, and whose market operated outside the boundaries of law, but businessmen nonetheless. "You saved his life," Nathan said quietly, settling into the chair across from her with his own cup of coffee, and the kind of exhaustion that came from stress rather than physical exertion. "More than that, you may have saved all our lives." Moretti's plan would have worked. The other families would have seen my retreat from Brooklyn as weakness and moved against me simultaneously. I wouldn't have survived that kind of coordinated assault. His voice carried a mixture of gratitude and something that might have been respect, the tone of someone who'd been forced to revise his assumptions about what strength looked like. "William saved his own life," she replied, watching the older man's chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of someone who'd finally allowed himself to sleep deeply. Everything I said in that warehouse, every strategy that made sense to Moretti, it came from things William had been teaching me for weeks. He knew this was coming, didn't he? All those lessons about reading financial documents, understanding the psychology of negotiation, seeing patterns in numbers that told stories about human behavior. He was preparing me for exactly what happened today. Nathan nodded, his expression carrying the kind of resignation that came from understanding that the people you loved sometimes made choices you couldn't protect them from. "Will has been expecting Moretti to make a move for months. The territorial pressure, the probing attacks on our operations, the way other families were positioning themselves to take advantage of any sign of weakness, he saw the pattern forming before I did. But instead of telling me to prepare for war, he prepared you to prevent one." The afternoon sun slanted through windows that looked out on a street where children rode bicycles and neighbors walked dogs, the kind of ordinary urban tableau that seemed surreal after the morning's events. She found herself thinking about fear and how it had transformed rather than paralyzed her, how terror had become a teacher rather than an enemy. The woman who'd been afraid to call a stranger's phone number 6 weeks ago had walked into a room full of armed men and negotiated for lives, not because she'd stopped being afraid, but because she'd learned that courage was fear walking forward anyway. "There's something else," Nathan said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had been postponed but couldn't be avoided indefinitely. "The arrangement with Moretti, the new territorial agreements, the partnership we've established, it changes everything about how my family operates. We're moving away from some of the more traditional aspects of the business, focusing on ventures that exist closer to the edges of legitimacy. Will has been advocating for this kind of transition for years." "And you're finally ready to listen to him?" she asked, hearing something in his tone that suggested this conversation was leading toward an offer or a choice she wasn't sure she was prepared to consider. Outside, a garbage truck made its way down the block with the mechanical patience of municipal routine, and she found comfort in the reminder that some things continued, regardless of how dramatically individual lives might change. "I'm ready to admit that maybe there are better ways to build an empire than the ones I learned on the streets," he replied, his admission carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades believing that survival required constant readiness for violence. "Will thinks you could help with that transition. You understand people, you see patterns others miss, and you've proven that you can function under pressure in ways that most people can't. The question is whether you'd be interested in a more permanent role in what we're building." The offer hung between them like a door that could lead in directions she couldn't predict. And she found herself thinking about choices and consequences in ways that would have been impossible before she'd learned that mathematics could describe relationships between power and vulnerability as precisely as it described relationships between numbers. What kind of role? She asked, not because she decided to accept, but because she needed to understand what she was choosing between. Chief Financial Officer for the Legitimate Operations Strategic Advisor for the transition away from traditional activities and General Manager for the Educational Foundation. Will wants to establish in memory of his teaching career. Essentially, you'd be helping us become the kind of organization that builds things rather than just protecting territory. Nathan's voice carried the tone of someone making an offer he hoped would be accepted, but was prepared to respect if declined. Before she could respond, William stirred in his chair, his eyes opening with the clarity of someone who'd been listening to their conversation despite appearing to sleep. "The decision is entirely yours, my dear," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority she'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks. "But I hope you'll consider that some of the most important work in the world involves helping people become better versions of themselves. Nathan has the potential to build something that could benefit thousands of people. But he'll need guidance from someone who understands that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down." The weight of the choice settled over her like a blanket, warm and heavy and impossible to ignore. She could return to her old life, find another job, serving coffee and counting tips, and pretend that the past 6 weeks had been an interlude rather than a transformation. Or she could accept that the woman who'd given a bowl of soup to a stranger in the rain had evolved into someone capable of preventing wars and building institutions that might outlast the people who created them. "The Educational Foundation," she said, testing the words to see how they felt in her mouth. "What exactly did you have in mind?" The question was directed at William, but she could see Nathan leaning forward with the kind of attention that suggested her interest mattered to him as much as it did to his father. "A school for children who've been written off by traditional institutions," William replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about something that had clearly been developing in his mind for years. "Kids from the streets like Nathan was, but also children whose potential has been overlooked because they don't fit conventional molds. A place where mathematics and literature and art are taught alongside practical skills like financial literacy and conflict resolution. We have the resources to make it extraordinary, and you have the insight to make it work." The vision he painted felt both ambitious and achievable, the kind of project that could justify the wealth that had been accumulated through methods that existed in moral gray areas. She thought about the students she might teach, children who needed someone to see potential where others saw only problems, and realized that this was what William had been preparing her for all along. Not just the crisis that had brought them to this moment, but the opportunity that would define what came after. "I have conditions," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Full transparency about all financial operations, complete autonomy over the educational programs, and a guarantee that we transition away from anything that involves violence within 5 years. I won't be part of building something beautiful on a foundation that hurts people even indirectly." The terms felt non-negotiable as she spoke them, and she watched both men's faces for signs of whether her conditions were acceptable or conversation ending. Nathan and William exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes, the kind of wordless conversation that happened between people who'd learned to trust each other's judgment completely. "Agreed," Nathan said, finally extending his hand across the table with the formality of someone sealing a contract that would bind them all to choices they couldn't unmake. "Welcome to the family business, Avery. The legitimate family business." As the sun set over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of better endings, Avery shook hands with a man who'd spent his life learning to survive in a world that rewarded violence, committing herself to helping him build something that might reward wisdom instead. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm. Children called in for dinner, lights came on in windows, where families gathered around tables to share food and stories, and the kind of ordinary love that made all the extraordinary risks worthwhile. She knew this peace was fragile, that the world they were trying to build would face challenges from those who preferred the old ways, but that only made it more precious. The old clock in the hallway marked the hour with a steady sound, neither ominous nor final. Just a live marking, not just the passage of another hour, but the beginning of something that none of them could have imagined when a waitress had offered soup to a stranger in the rain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to discover what they were capable of building together. But tonight, there was just the quiet satisfaction of having chosen hope over fear, construction over destruction, the possibility of redemption over the certainty of revenge. The funeral service for William Grayson was held on a Tuesday morning in late January, when the city wore winter like a gray wool coat. St. Patrick's Cathedral had been William's choice, and Avery understood why when she saw how the ancient stones seemed to hold decades of prayers and whispered confessions, the kind of sacred space that could accommodate both grief and redemption without judgment. The congregation was unlike anything she could have imagined. Former students sat next to men whose expensive suits couldn't quite disguise. Controlled tension teachers from Lincoln High School shared pews with people whose names appeared in federal investigations, and plainclothes security maintained respectful distance. Nathan sat in the front row, his grief genuine and visible, the raw emotion of someone who'd lost the only father he'd ever really known. Avery delivered the eulogy, speaking from the heart, as William would have expected. William Grayson taught mathematics for 37 years because he believed that numbers could describe the relationships between all things, including the relationship between who we are and who we might become. The William Grayson Memorial Academy occupied a renovated warehouse in the Bronx, designed according to specifications William had written during his final weeks. The building was beautiful but not ostentatious, equipped with technology that would give students access to opportunities they'd never imagined. Nathan had kept his promise about transitioning away from traditional aspects of his business, creating enterprises closer to legitimacy. 43 students start next month, Avery told Nathan over Chinese takeout in what would become the main classroom. The space smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings, all recommended by teachers who believe they have capabilities that haven't been properly recognized. Nathan smiled with warmth that had become frequent since William's death. Will always said the most important learning happened when students realized they were capable of more than they'd imagined. Spring arrived with hope that made even veteran New Yorkers believe in new beginnings. The Academy's garden was Avery's project, where students learned biology and chemistry through growing food for the cafeteria. She imagined William appreciating the metaphor of planting seeds that would grow into something both beautiful and nourishing. The season carried promises of growth, each green shoot emerging like a small miracle of persistence. The first graduation ceremony was held on a warm June evening when light streaming through tall windows made everything golden. 12 students received diplomas representing personal transformation, young people who'd learned to see themselves as scholars rather than statistics. Nathan gave the commencement address about second chances and the mathematics of hope. Summer brought continuity as the Academy attracted attention from educators who wanted to understand how a Bronx school achieved such results. Avery worked longer hours but felt more energized, fueled by daily evidence that education could transform lives. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she struggled with the unfamiliar weight of peace, wondering if she'd grown so accustomed to crisis that calm felt like waiting for catastrophe. Vincent Moretti attended the summer showcase, approaching Avery afterward with genuine pleasure. "This place carries his spirit," he said quietly. "Every child who walks through these doors will learn what William spent his lifetime teaching, that intelligence without compassion is just clever cruelty. But wisdom paired with kindness can change the world." Winter arrived in December, blanketing the city in peaceful silence. Avery stood at her apartment window looking out at Central Park, thinking about how grief had evolved into gratitude for time shared. Nathan joined her with 2 cups of tea, his now made with honey, a small addition William would have approved. "He knew, didn't he?" she asked, watching snowflakes dance in the streetlight. "He knew that helping one stranger would create ripples farther than any of us imagined." Will understood that the most elegant mathematical principle was also the simplest, Nathan replied. "He knew that love multiplied infinitely, while fear only divided. That kindness was the one constant that made all other equations possible." Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, 8 million stories intersecting in ways both random and inevitable. The mathematics of compassion William had taught them was the only formula that truly mattered.